Welcome back. I'm Dr. Alan Johnson, and on this channel, I talk about the mind, well-being, productivity, and change for thinkers, makers, and everyone in between. Every philosophical tradition has its roots. It has its backgrounds, its influences, regardless of how innovative it seems. And American Transcendentalism, for all of its incredible originality, didn't come out of nowhere. It was born out of European Romanticism, out of a time of poetry and rebellion and a longing and a hunger for something more than the dry, mechanical view of the world that came out of the Enlightenment and the rise of scientific materialism. And in this video, I want to trace that lineage from Romanticism to Transcendentalism, to show how the Transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau and Fuller were carrying forward and transforming a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of experiencing the world that was initially fostered by European romantics like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Goethe. But they were also making it distinctly American. It was much more local, much more embodied, and much more in keeping with the nation to dreams and ideals that the young American nation had. So let's take this walk together today from those misty mountains of European Romanticism to the sunlit, quiet forests of Concord, Massachusetts, and explore how literature became philosophy and how emotion and nature and selfhood all got braided together in the 19th century as a way to experience the world differently. So let's start then with Romanticism. Romanticism wasn't just about love poems and sunsets. Romanticism was actually a full-on revolt. It was a revolt against rationalism, against industrialization, and against the idea that the universe was just sort of one giant machine that we could figure out and explain and perfect. And Wordsworth, the great romantic poet, wrote, "Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect." Wow, what a line. He's saying here something really important, that by analyzing everything as the Enlightenment was teaching people to do, we begin to lose that thing itself. There's kind of a special sacredness in not knowing, a sacredness in the wonder or the awe that we bring to those beauteous forms of things. And carrying on from Wordsworth, we must be careful that we don't murder to dissect. There's a thread that Emerson then picks up on in Nature, where he says, "The invariable mark of wisdom is to see the miraculous in the common." So this is the same spirit, right? Romanticism and Transcendentalism both insist that the world is not inert and mechanical and dead, that the earth is alive, that we are part of it. And part of the extraordinary features of being alive is that we need to be surprised sometimes. We need to be bewildered and awestruck by the things that we see. Going back to the UK, Coleridge also had a big influence on European Romanticism, especially his idea of the imagination as a divine faculty, a divine ability that we have. Because for him, the imagination wasn't just that part of us that comes up with new ideas and new innovations and new thoughts. For Coleridge, the imagination was something that was sacred. The imagination was a way that we could participate in the creation of something. And this echoes so clearly in Emerson's idea of what he called the oversoul, the universal spirit that we're all connected to through our intuition, through our creativity, and ultimately through our imagination, that there is something above and beyond all of us that we are able to connect to and that we are all a part of, that fosters creative spirit and innovation and change. And then going back to Europe, there's Goethe. Emerson absolutely adored him, as did many who came after Goethe, because Goethe blended science and art and spirit in a really, really distinctive way. And it ultimately gave Emerson a model of how to hold on to paradox without trying to explain it away. Because the Enlightenment wanted definitive answers to everything. The belief that through the scientific method we could figure out a way to understand, to break down, to categorize, to order, to explain, to improve, and to ultimately impact upon the world through our rationality. And that is all well and good. And the developments of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution are extraordinary and have changed our lives fundamentally for the better. However, many people in that time were already beginning to recognize that we were also losing quite a bit through this new way of approaching the world. Most significantly, we were losing the ability to look at paradox, to observe two things that when set side by side might be simultaneously true. Rather than trying to resist that, trying to explain it, trying to analyze it, thinkers such as Goethe and Emerson invited us to revel in paradox, to recognize that the mystery and the awe that paradox creates is actually really important. You can be rigorous while also being spiritual. That's something that Goethe pointed out as well. You can be concrete and also idealistic, and you can be rooted in nature while also reaching toward the infinite. So these seeming polarities, Goethe and Emerson were able to not just balance, but were able to recognize that they coexist, that they are not binary opposites. And that holistic impulse that American philosophy inherited from European Romanticism is everywhere in Transcendentalism. It's everywhere in Emerson. It's everywhere in Thoreau. And it continues to provide us today a really, really valuable and important reminder of not trying to over describe, to over categorize, to allow ourselves to recognize the spirit of paradox and ambiguity. What the Transcendentalists did, and they were predominantly centered around Boston, Massachusetts, they localized all of these ideas. They made them more American. They made them more practical. If the European romantics were thinking big and grand and epic sweeping visions, the American transcendentalist didn't just want to write big epic grand poetry about the sublime. They wanted to live it. They wanted to take these ideas and build them into daily experience. And Thoreau very famously wrote, and I have a whole video on this as well, he famously wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately." And in writing this, he's taking the romantic impulse and grounding it, literally bringing it down into the earth. Instead of imagining vast, wild landscapes, he just walks out and lives in one. He plants his beans. He watches ants getting in fights and waging war. And he writes about all of it, not just as an observation, but as a revelation. He writes about all of this as if it was the grand sweeping majesty of a sublime romantic poem, because it ultimately is. It taps in to that same spirit and sensibility, but brings it into the everyday, into a way that we, even in the 21st century, can really understand and even for ourselves experience. And I need to talk also about Margaret Fuller, really the trifecta of the three great transcendentalists in America. And she takes emotional depth out of Romanticism and pushes it even further. She was one of the most significant thinkers of her time, but she was also one of the deepest feelers of her time. And Emerson actually had a lot to learn from her about how to feel and how to get caught up in the messiness of emotion that defines our human experience. For Margaret Fuller, the spiritual was never separate from the social. So the spiritual was not something that you do in a church or a temple. The spiritual was what you do when you are with people, when you are living your daily life. And she believed that self-culture, as she called it, was not just a part of justice, not just a part of a way to live, but a really important part of women's liberation. And Fuller was one of the most influential and earliest feminists in America. She was beginning to think about how we can take that emotional intensity from European Romanticism and begin to feel it, not to push it over to the mind of the great romantic genius, but how we can cultivate emotional sensibilities and relational abilities within ourselves to feel that sublime moment. So that's what we're really talking about here, tracing this development from Romanticism to Transcendentalism. It's this subtle transformation. It's not about revolution and radical change. The Transcendentalists were absolutely inspired by the Romantics. Romanticism planted a seed, and Transcendentalism took that seed and planted it in American soil at a time when American intellectual culture was still very much finding its place alongside European intellectual culture. The Transcendentalists, they weren't naive. They knew about injustice. They knew about war. They knew about inequality. These were the pressing matters of their time in the same way that they're the pressing matters of our own time. But they still chose ultimately to believe in the sacred potential of the individual soul. And that feels really, really important. And it's easy to forget just how revolutionary that was. This idea that you could trust your own experience because you didn't need the church or any other organization or system of hierarchy and power to explain things to you. You didn't need someone to mediate the divine. This really began to change the shape of American thought, and it still matters today. This is some of the earliest foundations of what we would later refer to as the American dream, which by the mid 20th century had taken on strictly materialist implications. But the Transcendentalists reminded us to slow down, to observe, to feel, and ultimately to live every moment of our lives as if it mattered. So if this video and these ideas resonated, you might enjoy the other videos in the series. I'm doing a deep dive into Transcendentalism over the next few months. And if it did resonate, drop a comment below to let me know what you connected with. I'd love to hear what thinkers or writers or quotations really lit up that sense of wonder for you. And until next time, stay curious and stay mindful. I'll see you then.